So welcome everybody to this afternoon's very special program. You're going to love it, I know. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager at Walton Library. And we've got a great program tonight from Bach to Brubeck with Gil Harel, great musicologist and presenter. We've had him here before with special guest, Chris Brubeck. And you're going to see a great presentation. You're going to hear some really, really great music tracks. And wait till you hear the commentary. So one quick note, your mics are off and your cameras are off. They should stay that way for the duration. And because we have a relatively large audience, the way we'll do Q&A activity is I've set it up so you can send questions to me through the chat. Now, if you send them to Gil or Chris, they may be very busy presenting, so they're not watching the chat window. So if you have a question, send it to me. If it looks like something we can deal with right on the fly, I'll forward it right to them. Otherwise, we'll sort of accumulate them and we'll deal with them at the end. So with that, I want to turn the forum over to our Executive Director, Elaine Tyloria, who's just got a few comments she would like to make, and then we'll get started with the program.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Michael. And thank you all for gathering with us virtually. As you know, Wilton Library will soon be the new home of the Brubeck Collection, which is one of the largest jazz archives in the world. It is truly a very special year for our library because it's also the centennial of Dave Brubeck and coincidentally, the 125th anniversary of our library. So it is my distinct privilege and pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers, Dr. Gil Harel and Chris Brubeck. Dr. Harel is a musicologist, as Michael said, and a music theorist whose interests include styles ranging from Western classical repertoire to jazz. He's currently assistant professor of music at Naugatuck Valley Community College and the recipient of several awards. Most recently, he was chosen as the winner of the 2019-20 Board of Regents System-Wide Teaching Award. He has given other presentations here in our library's Brubeck room, so it's a pleasure for me to welcome him back to our Wilton Library audience. Chris Brubeck needs no introduction. Chris is such a loyal friend of our library, generously sharing his musical genius and offering musical performances here in our Brubeck room. With his lovely wife, Tish, he provides incredible guidance for our Hot and Cool Jazz Concert series. Chris is a Grammy-nominated composer, a gifted arranger, and a multi-instrumentalist. He's featured on dozens of recordings with the Dave Brubeck Quartet and has played at all the great jazz festivals in the world. He's an advocate of arts education and serves on several advisory boards. Chris is also a founding director of the Brubeck Living Legacy, a nonprofit founded by the Brubeck family to honor and continue the legacy of their parents, Dave and Iola Brubeck. Chris has received numerous awards. However, in the interest of time, I could not possibly begin to list them. Suffice to say, we're all honored by his participation in this evening's program. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Gil. And now I'll turn things back over to Michael.
Thank you, Elaine.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Well, I think we've got a good intro. And so Gil and Chris, let's get started.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you to the Wilton Library. And of course, thank you to Chris. Indeed, a man who needs no introduction. He's a composer, arranger, multi-instrumentalist, piano, bass, of course, trombone. And I have to say that for me, the name Brubeck is synonymous with jazz royalty. So I've had a chance to hear some of your music, Chris, performed live, and I didn't imagine that we would ever get to do a program together. So if I could take off my musicologist hat for a moment and put on my fan hat, I would just like to say that this is a pretty cool moment for me right now. So of course, we're here to talk about the impact of two really iconic musicians from totally different centuries. J.S. Bach was born March 21st, 1685. And I'm not one for dates, but I always remember Bach's birthday because he and I are exactly 299 years apart. We share the same birthday. So if mom and dad had just waited another year. No, at any rate, what can I say about J.S. Bach? Well, we're going to talk a lot about him this evening, but of course, we're going to draw a dotted line between the repertoire and the legacy of Bach, all the way to a composer, a performer, a keyboardist, a fellow keyboardist who was born in 1920. As Elaine mentioned, this is the centennial. So we're going to talk about Bach, we're going to talk about Brubeck, and I think in doing so, we're going to connect the dots between two composers and two figures who may, from a distance, seem maybe disparate in terms of their stylistic proclivities and the qualities of the music. But when we put it under a microscope and cast our gaze and begin to really peel back the layers, we find a tremendous amount of similarity between the two, and a profound influence from Bach onto Dave Brubeck. And I think therefore you might say that a big part of Dave Brubeck's legacy is as a devotee and interpreter and someone who is very much influenced by Bach and by the Baroque style. So that's our exposition, since we're going to be rolling up our sleeves and talking about music tonight. Exposition is a word that comes up quite a bit in musical form in terms of our program tonight. That's sort of the objective for us. I like to think that for every lecture, for every chat, for every interview, whatever it is that we have on the itinerary, we want to set objectives for ourselves as audience members and listeners and fans. So we have a real wonderful opportunity tonight to hear from someone who has such a rich, vibrant, not only a history himself, but also this incredible lineage that takes him back. And Chris, I'm going to ask you to go in your way back machine and maybe talk a little bit about the name J.S. Bach and what it meant to you as a budding musician, someone who was coming up. Obviously, I know you could talk for hours about what it was like to grow up as a Brubeck, but maybe if you could talk a little bit about J.S. Bach, your early experiences hearing it, and of course, any nuggets that your dad, breadcrumb trail, so to speak, about this monumental composer that we're going to be discussing.
Well, for sure, growing up in our household, Bach was right up there with Jesus and Gandhi. It's important, amazing figures to be appreciated and to sort of dive into what they stood for. And a lot of people know it's just kind of confusing that my father was into classical music. But in the same way that a lot of people would say, oh, Andre Previn was a jazz player and he came from out of classics. Now, Andre Previn was a real classical player that adapted and learned how to play jazz. My father grew up on a ranch, and for some bizarre reason that our family never could figure out, his mom was a classical piano player. So he heard tons of Bach when he was growing up. But Dave was not a classical prodigy. He was such an improviser that, in a way, the idea of sitting down and having the discipline to really plow through all the various Bach challenges was just not in his makeup. And yet I'm glad that whatever his learning abilities or disabilities were, that he sort of said, oh, well, I've got to make up things like Bach because I can't just sit there and read it and pump it out like a lot of people. But I think one of the things that I always loved about Bach was the rhythmic inevitability of when it starts chugging along, it really swings. I mean, it's not trying to swing like, Ward Swingle, the Swingle singer sounding like Bach. Just Bach organically does. And it's, as I got older and older, it's like blue cheese or something. I got to love it more and more. It's just, I think it's perfect music. Like, if there's music in heaven, I fully expect that you come in and you'll hear Bach fugues playing and everything. It's so mathematically wonderful. Yeah. But forget the math and the proportionality and everything that's so exactly right about it. It just sounds great. I mean, it's beautiful, beautiful music.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Bach's music, I think what gripped me, and of course, many of the listeners know, I wrote my dissertation on Bach. And perhaps what I found most intriguing about Bach at first was the rhythm, that motoric quality that you talked about, that sense of inevitability, the steady stream of 16th notes, or maybe it's a bass line that chugs along in steady walking eighth notes, let's say. It really lays the foundation for what we call the walking bass line centuries later.
Absolutely.
And I actually, in one of my groups that I conduct on campus, we were supposed to perform a Bach cantata, and one of the movements, the middle movement of Cantata 106, has this incredibly, almost motoric bass line that just moves in steady steps, mostly, in increments of seconds. So they're just moving, and you think about it, adjacent keys on the keyboard. And everything above it, there's so much complexity, so much intricacy swirling around, and somehow he makes it all fit together. It really is, like you said, heavenly music in a way.
Yeah.
So that's so cool. And you mentioned Jesus. We're going to talk about him later a little bit. When
He's
we
the joy of man's desiring,
Gandhi, we're not going to get to, but Jesus is definitely on the program tonight. When we get to the St. Matthew Passion, we're going to talk a little bit later on about vocal music. But first, I want to start with instrumental music. And before we dive into specific repertoire, I want to get back to something you said. You talked about this disparity between jazz musicians and classical musicians. And you mentioned Andre Previn and, of course, Dave. I find it so interesting that many people, including people who study music, are fascinated by this connection between jazz musicians and classical. And sometimes there's this presupposition that, well, they're different, right? One of them studies a certain way and another studies another way, and they don't listen to each other's music, and they don't have an interest in learning the stylistic tendencies or the idiomatic ways to play. And of course, that's true sometimes, but with great musicians, and maybe perhaps I'm generalizing a bit here, it seems to me that with really great musicians, we find that they are fascinated, they're so interested in sort of what the other side is doing, what's going, and I think of stories like, for example, Charlie Parker, who sometimes gets maligned and stigmatized because of his personality and because of his inner demons that he battled. But Charlie Parker, first of all, it's well known that he was very interested in not just so-called classical music or neoclassical music, but in specifically, to name a few pieces, Stravinsky's Firebird and Petrushka. And there are stories about him traveling when he was on the road and having these scores sort of in his back pocket, so to speak. And it tickles me so much to think of Charlie Parker looking at a score of Igor Stravinsky's Petrushka. But there are so many witnesses that corroborate it. You have a unique perspective because you really have tread in both worlds throughout your career, working primarily in the jazz EDM, but also having at least a few toes in the classical world. Can you speak a little bit about this invisible line and what your experience has been in learning these styles? We're going to talk more about it now, but maybe you could give us a little intro.
Well, for the people listening who are probably mostly from Wilton right now, I will say it's kind of organic. I went from playing trombone. I started in 4th grade in Wilton Public Schools, and then I got a little better. I'm a big advocate of always playing in groups of people a little better than you. So I started playing the Norwalk Youth Symphony. So that was my exposure to classical music as a participant. Then I got to go to the Interlochen Arts Academy, where I was with all these, what I call mutants. There's unbelievably good kids that played like they were at Juilliard.
I know the type.
Yeah, maybe you're one of them. I wasn't, but I hung in there. So being around all that orchestral music was really very important to me, being in just soaking it all up. And I wasn't like Charlie Parker, or perhaps you. I'm sitting in orchestra and I'm counting bar after bar until the trombones come in. Some kids were smart and they had to score and they were studying, and I'm going like, oh, look at those nerds, So that wasn't me. But despite myself, I really did learn quite a bit about classical music. And the other thing people might be surprised is when I was playing with my father, let's say in the early 70s, and we were doing things like, well, I know we'll get to eventually, like Brandenburg Gate Revisited. We were playing with orchestras. And a lot of the orchestras had members that were older Europeans who fled and came to America after World War II. And they really pretty much hated the fact that the classical players would have to deign to perform with these gutter trash jazz musicians. Really, even to my dad, their attitude, like they show up, you know, with like about 50 pounds of Kleenex over their ears and like winter earmuffs, you know, these subtle ways of displaying the fact we're too loud, we're no good, you know, that kind of thing. And of course, they would see the audience really respond to it well, but it's just like they don't belong together. That was their vibe. Luckily for me, Dave also worked with Leonard Bernstein. They were the early pioneers of crossing the genres. And then luckily, in terms of how the times changed over the decades, we had something like someone like Gunther Schuller, who coined the term third stream music. And when he started New England Conservatory, he said there should be a place for jazz musicians to be in the same stable as these young, creative, you know, highly motivated classical musicians. So those kids started going to school together, growing up together. The young classical players started saying, wow, these guys don't belong in the gutter just because they're jazz musicians. You know, they actually can really play well, and they actually practice, and they can do something we can't do. They can improvise. So then you had 2 or 3 generations growing up, mutually respecting each other from dorms and playing in each other's recitals. And now when we play with an orchestra, it's all, you know, even if they're 50 years old, they come out of this completely different culture of respecting jazz. And Dave and Leonard Bernstein had a lot to do with getting that ball rolling, with Gunther Schuller sort of academically making it official.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned some of those figures. Gunther Schuller famously, of course, as you said, coined the term third stream, and he did so at a lecture at my old alma mater at Brandeis University. And Bernstein, and throw another name in there, Aaron Copland, they were clearly so smitten with the jazz sound. With Bernstein, not only do you hear it obviously in West Side Story, but you also, I mean, he's got prelude, fugue, and riffs, which is clearly like his take as this Harvard-educated, brilliant musician who's osmosing and absorbing this emergingly popular idiom. And since you mentioned it, there's an Aaron Copland quote that I love to share with my students. When he went over to Europe to study, this was in the era of increasingly obscure and complex and opaque music, 12-tone music. And when he came back, he was asked, what did you learn over there? And he said, I learned that they're scaring everybody out of the concert hall.
That was an honest thing to say.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of a joke I heard recently. You know, the CDC released this numerical system of grading how dangerous events are to attend. So, you know, a concert would be a 9 out of 10 because there's a chance you could get sick and so on and so forth. And a restaurant is a 7. And they said, what qualifies as a 1? And the answer is a modern music concert.
Yes, no one's there.
No one's there. So
well, while we're on the subject of talking about what classical musicians were interested in jazz, as you know, and maybe many people listening know, my father was lucky enough that after World War II, on the GI Bill, he was able to study with the French composer Darius Milhaud.
At Mills, right?
Yeah, at Mills College, which was a women's college, and it's a long story of how he ended up there. But it was much better than the alternative, being a French Jew when Paris was occupied by the Germans. He ended up at Mills College, and my father would start to go to Milhaud, and he said, and Milhaud said, "Why do you want to study with me?" He said, "Because you're a master composer. You know everything about writing for orchestra." And I always dreamed that if I survived World War II, that I would try to write a piece that would somehow try to bring mankind together in a better way. And I really want to get the skills to learn how to do that. And so Milhaud said, well, that's really interesting. And you know, the thing is that interests me is that you're a jazz musician, right? And Dave said, yes. And he said, well, that really interests me. And he said, oh, wow, I'm really surprised, because we think, you know, over here in America, that the best thing in the world is obviously, you know, what you're doing, and you're a descendant conceptually of Satie and all these kinds of things. And he said, well, what really interests me is that, you know, I went to Harlem in the late teens of, you know, 1919 or something like that. And it was really Milhaud that was the first guy before Gershwin to put saxophone in the creation of the world using blues pentatonic scales and all that. So he'd always say to Dave, you want to study with me? The first thing I require you to do, play some bougie for me. That's how the lessons always started.
I love that story. I never heard that before. That's tremendous. We could talk for ages, I'm sure, about your early experiences with Dave and with Bach, and I love the connection with Mio. It's such an important one. But maybe we'll talk a little bit, since you talked about it earlier, this skill set, this tool belt that jazz musicians carry, which makes them so unique. And we're going to connect the dots back to the Baroque period, because it really is something that existed then and exists now in the jazz community, but has really been lost to these, you can have fantastic classically trained musicians who can't do it. And of course, we're talking about something that to use is probably as easy as breathing, and that's improvising. Extemporaneously creating music either over a chord progression or sometimes in freer contexts with more abstract ideas, which, to give you a short anecdote, and I'm sure you've got plenty of stories like this. When I was in college, I played with some string players who were classically trained, came from musical families, had been playing violin for ages. And when I handed them a score to Miles Davis's So What, which of course has exactly 2 chords in it.
Right.
It's a little more complex than that because it's modal, but it's D minor 7, E flat minor 7. And she looked at me like a deer in the headlights. She said, "What do you expect me to do here?" And I just love that, because with all of her perfect pitch and sight reading skills, this was so nebulous to her, it was unattainable. She had no clue what to do.
Right.
Anyway, I want to share some images that are going to take us back to the Baroque period, and then we'll look at some jazz notation. And I think in doing so, we'll see the similarity there. Okay, so here is a trio sonata by a Baroque composer. In this case, it's Arcangelo Corelli. And for the audience members, you'll see these numbers over the bass notes. So you can see a 6 here, a 4 and a 2 there, a 6, etc. Sometimes you'll see the kids call it a hashtag. Of course, musicians call it a sharp sign. This is pretty esoteric notation to a modern musician. There are very few people who are trained today to read this. We call it figured bass. And what it says is essentially, okay, we're in C major. Now, most musicians would be able to tell that, I hope, or we're in A minor, but in this case, C major. And then we see a B in the bass with a number 6, which tells us that we want a 6th above it. And that would mean, of course, that we want a G chord with a B in the bass, first inversion. Then we have a 4-2, which tells us, okay, I want a 4th above B, which would be in this case, E and a C. So this is C major 7 with first a 3rd inversion. It gets pretty complex. And, most musicians, if given enough time, would be able to puzzle it out. But of course, in the Baroque period, they would have to look at this, and sometimes at much faster tempos than Largo, which is slow. They'd have to realize, okay, this is C major, and now I have, a D minor 7 with a C in the bass, and now I have G major with a B in the bass, and now I've got C major 7 with a B in the bass, and so on and so forth, and realize it in real time. So this is a pretty arcane skill, not very commonly used today, unless you're in the jazz world, because jazz musicians have a very similar system that they use. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share, and then I'm going to have to reshare because I've got a PDF file to share for us here. And this is what we call lead sheet notation. And this is jazz shorthand. This is bread and butter for jazz musicians, especially when you're sort of casually, extemporaneously creating music. The difference here is, instead of having a bass line with numbers, typically what we get is a melody and then these chord symbols, which, I made a reference to earlier. I said this is C major 7 over B, or it's G major over B, or D minor 7 over C. Jazz musicians use a remarkably similar system. And again, most classical musicians would have trouble reading this. I wonder if we were to give a classical conservatory player a chart and say, okay, here's the melody, and now just comp chords. Some of them get really thrown off, Chris, in my experience, by not having specific rhythms notated for the left hand or for the bass line. I find that fascinating, and I take great delight, I must say, in teaching my students at NDCC how to read both figure bass and jazz lead sheet notation. Because I know when I was a student, we talked a little bit about figure bass, but we never talked about lead sheet notation. And I always found that strange. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of the written language of jazz musicians and classical musicians and how they differ?
Well, at first I want to say that that's really one of the little nuggets of wisdom I always heard from my dad, you know, is that figured bass and chord changes were really quite similar. And also, when people would come down on him for trying to integrate jazz with classical music, he'd say, wait a minute, I'm the guy that's really being an originalist, you know, because it was in there. Cadenzas were improvised. And you know far better than I, because I think you've done more historic time traveling into the period. But you know, I don't know if they handed out music like you just were showing, where people were given these outlines, but if they kind of improvised their parts based on the information, which is really what jazz musicians are doing. Did they do that, Gil?
Absolutely, yeah. Here, let's go back to, if we go back to the Corelli score, this is violin 1, this is violin 2. And if you were playing keyboard, this was all you got.
Wow.
That was it.
Well,
there's bass line, this third line here, this third staff in the system. So what you would have to do is, as I said, you know, you'd have to puzzle out the chords. But Chris, as you mentioned, you know, how you phrase those chords and what voicing, you know, do you want a close voicing? Do you want to spread it out a bit? Do you want those dissonances to be really punchy and have that minor second grinding, or do you maybe want to spread it out? Those were decisions they had to make on the spot, lickety split. And every time they played it, it would probably sound different.
Wow.
So improvising 350 years ago in the days of Corelli was so important. This wasn't an optional skill. You needed to be able to do it, much like a jazz musician needs to be able to improvise. There's no such thing as a professional jazz musician who can only play something that's written out. You have to be able to extemporaneously create. And it's been lost, right? You get past the days of Beethoven, and as we get closer to our own period, at some point, so-called classical musicians just stopped improvising.
We've talked about this before, but I think it's kind of a cute story that was first told to me when I was a kid from Bill Crowfoot, who was a banjo player that loved to play Bach on the banjo, and he used to
listen to him later on.
Oh, okay, yeah. So he used to live in Wilton, but he would say, well, the one place that improvisation lived on was in organ players playing in church, which one would consider classical musicians. But he said there was a very practical reason they learned that skill, because they would look from the loft, and when they were passing the basket and people were putting the money in for the collection, if it looked like people were in a giving mood, it was like stretch, stretch. So they'd have to improvise to get more money for the church. And that's why it survived. And he may have been kidding, but maybe there's a lot of elements of truth in that funny story.
Oh, I could see it. I love that. I could definitely see that being possible. You know, we know that music affects the psychological state of the listener. So it makes perfect sense to me that a very sagacious keyboardist up in the organ loft would put that knowledge to good use. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move over to some music by Bach. We'll listen to just a little clip of it, and then we're going to move over to a similarly named piece. This is Brandenburg Concerto number 5 in D major, and the ensemble here is the Netherlands Bach Society. They've been making some waves in the Bach performance community, everything with period instruments, as we'll see here. You know, you can see the harpsichord and the transverse flute. Very small ensemble. The Brandenburg Concerti were written 1720, so let's say about 300 years ago. And there's a funny story with this collection. There's 6 concerti, all featuring different instruments, which was a totally novel thing to do, to have a concerto, which is essentially a work for soloists plus a ripieno, or a backup choir of instruments. And Bach just comes up with these bizarre, sometimes such strange combos, like Brandenburg 2 has a piccolino trumpet, oboe, recorder, and violin. And there's your solo group. And nowadays we kind of scratch our heads. We imagine that they must have scratched their heads 3 centuries ago. I chose this piece to start because it features a really groovy, improvised, quasi-improvised keyboard solo. And for that reason, it's regarded by some musicologists as one of the really early examples of a true concerto. Now it is written out, but it has such a free quality that it feels improvised, especially when you're not watching the musician. In this case, we'll see him and his eyes are clearly on the sheet music, so we can tell that he's not improvising. But the other reason I chose this is because in various interviews, when your dad would talk about Bach, often Dave would cite specifically the Brandenburg Concerti and talk about the rhythmic energy and the vitality that sort of pours out of the music. So we'll listen to a little bit of this, and then we'll go to a 1958 record that your dad made, Brandenburg Gate, which is so, it's not just that it's influenced by Bach, but to me, as someone who's studied Bach, you know, it seems trivial to say it from such a seasoned musician, but it's been almost 20 years now that I've been really immersed in Bach study. What tickles me about Dave's Bach-inspired pieces is how, as a jazz musician, he's able to absorb such an authentic flavor of Bach's music. So let's listen to Brandenburg 5. I'm going to play the introductory measures, and then we'll go to the cadenza, just a couple of minutes, and then we'll go over to Brandenburg Gate. Oh, I got to share computer sound, and here we go. So one of the things that I love here, we could listen to this, of course, till the end, but one of the things that I love here is the call and response between the soloists, right? So you've got the harpsichord who's chugging away, but then you've got the solo violin and the solo flauto traverso, as Bach would have called it. We would call it a flute or a transverse flute. Transverse, of course, meaning held perpendicular to the body, as opposed to what Bach would have called a regular flute, was what we call a recorder, oddly enough. But you have this thing, so repeating these triplet figures, and it's like statement, response, violin, flute. And I love that. We're going to hear that call and response texture and echoes of it in Dave's music later on in the program. Let's jump ahead to something like the 8-minute mark, and we get to this cadenza. I mean, so many awesome things. Chris, so when you listen to that, what sort of pops out to you is, man, this is such a forward-looking piece.
Well, I was thinking in sort of very mundane terms, but it was like you're listening to a well-tuned Bach like race car, and all of a sudden, boom, it just went into a higher gear, and and then the chromatic modulation started. You go to pick up the pace, and then he was just like a whirling dervish on the harpsichord. That's like the loudest damn harpsichord I've ever heard in my life.
It really is. Actually, he opens up both manuals at the end. It really unleashes the full sound. What I love about it is if we go back to like right after those diminished seventh rolls that you mentioned, watch his left hand here. I think this is so cool because this is so not Baroque, and yet it's written in 1720, so it must be Baroque. Let's have another listen. Right here.
Yeah, it's like stride piano.
It's like stride piano, and it's 1720 that he's writing this. It's just mind-boggling to see that happening. We can read through one Bach score after another, the French suites, the English suites, the keyboard partitas, the inventions, which we're going to talk about. And you just never see that. He just doesn't, hit a bass note and then jump up 2 octaves to get a chord. And that's exactly what we have here. So for those who are curious about the origins of jazz and stride piano and ragtime, most musicologists talk about the early 20th century or the late 19th, but gosh, I think you could make an argument that Brandenburg 5 is spreading maybe some of those, that seed is being dispersed into the ether, and musicians are going to pick up on it much later on. All right. One last thing about this collection of the Brandenburg Concerti. Bach, when he wrote it, he was hoping to get some money. His family was growing, and he was living in Weimar at the time, or actually at this point he had moved to Anhalt-Köthen. And so he's living in this sort of sleepy Calvinist court, and he's trying to earn an honorarium. So he writes it and dedicates it to this guy, Christian Ludwig, who was a relation of Frederick the Great and had this title, Margrave of Brandenburg. And that's how we get this name, the Brandenburg Concerti. So what did this guy say when he got the music? He hands it over to his, whoever it must have been, his court musicians, his Kapellmeister, and he says, "What do you think of this music?" And the guy looks at him and goes, "Oh, it's impossible to play. It's way too hard." And so it sat on a shelf for 130 years before it was discovered in 1849. And Bach didn't earn a penny from writing it. So I love that. It's so iconic. We hear the Brandenburg Concerto, or in the case of Dave, Brandenburg Gate, or Brandenburg Gate Revisited. And Brandenburg, it was named after this one aristocrat. And this guy, basically the musicians at his court, looked at the score and said, "Man, this is crazy." It reminds me of what it must have been like to be in the studio with Coltrane in '59 when he hands you the changes for Giant Steps. It's musicians are so funny that way. All right, let's take a look at this. I love this album cover. I know as a kid you mentioned that this when we were speaking earlier that this must have struck you as kind of well, let you tell it.
Well, I have to admit, it struck me even when I was like 5 years old, whatever. I said, that kind of looks corny. But it got the message across. Obviously, my old man had been flying over to Eurasia and on Pan Am, the big international airplane, and coming back with different souvenirs in his little Pan Am bag. And that's the only time I've ever seen him in a sultan's cap or whatever.
He wears it well. So this is 1958, which is, jazz history is fascinating in general, but the late 50s are especially interesting. And of course, I think it's in 1959 that we're going to get Take 5 and Unsquared Dance and Blue Rondo and all those great experiments with meter. But here we are in 1958, and Dave's love of Bach is just pouring out of this track. So it's called Brandenburg Gate. Later on, he would arrange some of this music for a full orchestra, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I want to play this whole track. It's 7 minutes long, And some pointers to the audience to listen for before we listen. I think it's always good to have program notes or some buoy floating there, bobbing up and down in the waves, so that as listeners, we can sort of keep our eyes trained, or in this case, our ears trained on moments where the music shifts or changes. And one of the big moments, Chris, that you pointed out to me when we were first sort of hatching this this idea was this remarkable moment towards the end, 5 minutes or so in, where we hear Paul Desmond and Dave, and they're both improvising. And Dave it's hard to get inside a musician's head, but what it seems to me is that he's kind of listening to what Paul does, and then he's filling it in with not just chords that he would be comping. That's typical, right? All keyboardists and guitarists and bassists and drummers learn to do that, to feed off of a soloist and try to play with them or maybe against them to create tension. But what Dave does here, and what Dave and Paul really do together, is so monumental. Can you talk about that?
Well, they were both in Darius Milhaud's class, and Milhaud loved jazz so much that to be different, he would tell his students to not, maybe some other teachers would say, here, take this Bach piece, analyze the chords, and you write your own variation of that. But he would say, hey, here's a jazz tune that has these really cool chords, and why don't you take it and put counterpoint to a jazz tune? He sort of reversed the teaching techniques. So the first group that Dave was in that recorded was called the Octet, and Paul was sort of a ringer that was brought into the Octet. He wasn't one of the official guys. But these experimentations of let's take from classical music what's great, and let's try to improvise over the bass line like figured bass. And it's a weird combination of leaving space for the other musician to put in their ideas, being agile enough to respond to those ideas in an imitative way, or maybe take the rhythmic cell of what someone just played and transpose it harmonically to fit the chord that's coming around the corner. In a way, it's almost like those video games that my son used to love to play. You're driving a car and you don't know what's coming around, whether you're about to hit a tree or a rock, a goat jumping off a cliff, whatever it is, but it's music, and you got to make it flow, and you're going forward and looking backwards, and it's incredible. Certain musicians have a sixth sense about it, and Paul and Dave definitely had that.
They have it. And of course, for the audience members, we are getting a little bit technical here, but that's the nature of Baroque music. The main reason musicologists say that Baroque music went out of fashion is because people wanted something simpler. And what makes it complex is this texture that Chris was talking about, this polyphonic texture, multiple independent sounds, which instead of clashing or getting in the way, or in the analogy of the video game, the tree getting in front of the car, it somehow, space-time curves around it to accommodate it, and we get this complementary sound. And we have a fancy word for this, we call it counterpoint. It refers to the interaction of independent voices. And normally when you're playing keyboard, I keep saying keyboard to tie it back to Bach, who was primarily an organist. If you're playing piano or guitar or drums or bass, and you're playing with a soloist, your main job is to accompany. It's not to solo simultaneously or to play something that has a contrasting rhythmic profile. But that's the nature of counterpoint. And of course, Dave was a big fan of counterpoint. Later on, he would write fugues and really intricate, rule-bound styles of music in genres that are just not what we would immediately associate with the fugue, or in this case with contrapuntal soloing. So I'm going to go ahead and play all of Brandenburg Gate. Again, this is 1958, and many listeners will immediately notice the distinctive timbre of Paul Desmond's alto sax playing, that smoothness, that rich quality, which was so much a part of his signature. But I think what's interesting here is the shifts in you might call it idiom or style, how it starts out and the beat is very strict and very sort of metrically correct. And then all of a sudden, it's like the belt is loosened a little bit and we just relax and melt into this sort of medium tempo swing. I'm going to stop talking and play it. Here we go. there's so many cool things happening here, but just to connect the dots back to Bach, it opens with this call and response, right? Which is exactly what we saw in Brandenburg 5, written in 1720. Here we are in 1958, and you have this, if you're writing a piece calling it Brandenburg Gate, obviously an homage to this composer and to this collection of works. One of the ways to do that is to borrow some of the stylistic elements. And by beginning this with the call and response, he really harkens back to that Baroque style. When, we think of the concerto as this form for solo instrument, right? We think of Brahms and Tchaikovsky, and of course, all the great composers. Beethoven wrote 5 piano concerto, and Mozart wrote 27, according to the Köchel catalog. But really, in the Baroque period, it was all about having multiple soloists, not just one soloist. And this is really framed as a concerto type texture for 2 soloists, piano and of course, alto saxophone. Chris, you're a bass player. Can you talk about, I think it's Joe Benjamin playing on this album?
Yeah, actually, I'm not sure. I mean, it could be Eugene Wright because of the year. It's right. I know that Eugene Wright did the State Department tour in 1958, which, if it's Jazz Impressions of Eurasia, I think that has to do with the specific tour.
Okay,
but,
so I'd have to look it up. I don't know, but as a bassist, when you're sort of playing in this style, what's that like when you're sort of flirting? I guess the question is, when you're flirting between 2 idioms, what's it like? Because I've noticed what Dave is doing here is, even though there is this feeling of swing, Dave is playing straight 8th notes. Da, 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 da. So can you talk about, as a rhythm player, you're both obviously, piano, bass, and trombone. So you wear all those hats. But as a bassist, I'm listening to the bass here. I'm thinking, that's pretty cool, actually. It's in the background, like most bass parts. We don't think of it first, but if you cast your ear towards it, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, well, the bass player in a jazz quartet, let's say, forget this example specifically, but in a way, we're the most restricted player in a quartet. We're more restricted in terms of the expected functionality of at least of this style of jazz. Drummers can be more free, although in this case, presuming that's Joe Morello, he's being remarkably tied up, just going. But bass players, functionally, we keep track of the structure, the form, like if it's a 24-bar tune or whatever. And I know a lot of times when I'm playing with Dave in a situation like this, I'm trying like crazy to listen, because I don't want to play the root if he's decided to play an inversion. A lot of times I'd be at the end of the piano where I can't see his hand. So suddenly, the computer in your brain is calculating tendencies. If this is descending chromatic, is he going to go to the root or just continue to hit a third because that's closer to the chromatic direction he's going? You're doing that kind of stuff.
I got to tell you, I have some students who are in the call right now, and they're probably smiling ear to ear, because we always talk about how parallel octaves just sort of destroys the independence. So what you just said is such a musical impulse to have. Thank you for pointing that out.
And the other thing though is it's sometimes you can kick things off like, okay, I'm going to play the roots, but maybe, for example, instead of playing squarely on 1, I'll go with boom, 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 and then you get a rhythmic cell going, for a variation. And you and I were talking earlier about sometimes, like everyone just heard the duet quality of Dave and Paul Desmond, but I've been involved in performances where Bill Smith, another octet member with clarinet, would get in there. And my brother Matthew is a cellist with skills that go in both directions. Right. And my brother Darius is a pianist, or Bobby Milicello on sax. And we've had times when we've had, or in Jerry Mulligan, by the way, sometimes he played his tune.
Barry sax player, sure.
Yeah, so we've had 3 or 4 people going, and there's been times, well, I would admit, sometimes it's sort of like a harmonic traffic jam, but there's been other times when we're looking at each other like, holy God, how did that just work out? We all just interweaved each other and didn't get in each other's way. And we look over and we're at the head, and you can see we're laughing like, holy, it was like going down a ski slalom, and hitting every gate, every Brandenburg gate together.
Yeah. I love that. Oh man, I got to tell you that I had some experience with collective improvisation. first, when I was starting to play with, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, play with ensembles where the musicians were better than I was so that I would get better. And I remember we had a summer workshop where we played a ton of Mingus. And, there is this quality in some Mingus and Sue's changes and even Monin and pieces like that where you feel like this is flirting between really musical moments and utter chaos. But this, what we just heard with Paul and Dave, is so elegant, and it's like a crystalline structure that fits so well that, unless I would have to be convinced. If I didn't know the musicians in question, if I was just listening to a record, this is what I heard, I would think, oh no, they wrote that out, they planned that. That must have been, curated somehow. But then, knowing what knowing that it's improvised, truly their skill and their understanding of each other's impulses as musicians, that's very hard to cultivate. I'm sure you would agree.
Yeah, I do. And I want to amplify your statement by saying that one very memorable thing happened to me once as my group was playing something, not necessarily where we're in a Bach imitative kind of way, but there was a Q&A afterwards, and this lady said to me, she said, I so enjoyed this performance. She was a little old lady. It was fantastic. And the way you guys were playing up there, it was almost as if you made it up as you went along. And, so I just was so tickled by that, because I'm not just like sort of making fun of her comment.
No, I think
it's like what you're talking about. It's like, it's unimaginable that you could be making that up as you went on. You must have actually all memorized that.
Exactly.
And then somehow presented it. But on a good night, a good jazz group can do exactly what you said. You said that must have been written out when it wasn't. And probably a great Baroque group. Probably Bach had his favorite set of musicians, like, oh man, that viola da gamba player, man, he's got ears as big as Ray Charles. I'm like, I want him on the gig,
I love that. Oh man. All right, I'm going to move on. I'm going to skip a couple of pieces, and I want to talk about vocal music and faith, and then we'll look at a really interesting record that your dad did. So we have some German here. This is O Haupt voll Blut und Wunden from most musicians know it from the St. Matthew Passion. Bach was such a devout individual. His particular brand of Lutheranism is what the theologians call pietist Lutheranism, which I remember asking my dissertation advisor to describe what is pietist Lutheranism. And he kind of half smiled and he said, it's no fun Lutheranism. It was a kind of an ethos in which the devotees focused on sinfulness and often eschatological things, meaning pertaining to the world to come, pertaining to the kingdom of heaven. They meditated on sin quite a bit. And this particular melody dates from the 16th century, like a lot of Bach melodies, which, Bach would take these tunes and harmonize them, basically put a bass line on it, fill in the inner voices, and then you get these magical 4-part creations, which I remember when I was an undergrad, one of my professors, Yehudi Weiner, saw me carrying around a bunch of scores, and he said, what do you got there? And I said, well, I've got, some Debussy and I have some Beethoven. And he said, no, what's that on top? I said, well, it's the Bach 371 4-part chorales. And he looked at me and he said, no, that's not what that is. And I said, sir? And he said, that's the Bible right there. In other words, like this is the blueprint. How do you write harmony, study the Bach chorales? So here's this famous chorale melody, and it has this very unique contouring. Bum, ba, da, dee, da, da, dum, ba, da, 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 da. It's best associated with the St. Matthew Passion, which is, of course, is 2.5-hour oratorio Bach wrote on the final hours of Christ, the story of the Passion, the arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, the trial before Pontius Pilate. And he harmonizes this chorale and presents it no fewer than 7 times in the Passion. And so when people think of Bach's vocal music, justifiably, they think of faith and what we call liturgical music as opposed to secular music. And this is a great example. I'm going to play a little bit of this melody It is originally a Lutheran tune, but it's such a good tune that in the middle of the 20th century, I guess, must have been sometime after Vatican II, it was officially adopted by some Catholic churches. So curious to think what Bach would have thought of that. We won't go there. Listen to O Haupt voll Blut und Wunden from the St. Matthew Passion. And it's just hair-raising stuff, really. I remember when I was a student, give you a lot of student anecdotes now. First hearing this at Jordan Hall, and at NEC, they did a performance of it. I remember which group it was, Emmanuel Music maybe, but I remember hearing this chorale and being very struck by it, not just by the melody. Later on, as I would study it, I was just mesmerized by this inner voice, right, and the way Bach harmonizes it. You know, he got a blueprint, he got a melody. He wasn't told what chords go along with it. So how he presents it is very much a personal interpretation of how he thinks. In this case, this particular harmonization ends in F major, but some of them don't end like that. The same melody, totally different sound. All right, we're going to go to, here's a record. And you can see a lot of heavy hitters on this one. This is a really sort of cross-genre collaboration. And there's Dave front and center. We think of jazz as being primarily an instrumental genre, right? Of course, there have been great jazz vocalists, and there continue to be great jazz vocalists. But primarily, it is thought of, and it really is statistically an instrumental genre. But clearly, Dave was drawn to vocal music. Can you talk a little bit about that? What you grew up with, and what your memories are in terms of vocal music influencing your dad?
Well, some of his early groups, just to survive in the San Francisco Bay Area, included singers, often ladies, to front the band. My dad used to be terribly shy. He didn't like to talk in the microphone whatsoever. But I also know he was incredibly proud of his collaboration with Louis Armstrong, who has one of the greatest voices of all time, and you could recognize it in a second. and that was a project he did with my mom, Iola Brubeck, doing a lot of the lyrics, and that was called The Real Ambassadors. It came out of that 1958 tour about the idea of American musicians touring on behalf of the State Department and sort of putting the great freedom American values overseas. But without getting into that too deeply, on the same record with Louis Armstrong was also Carmen McRae as the female lead in this musical they wrote, and Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. And so there you have some of the forces on this record. He was really proud of the record he did with Jimmy Rushing, which is a fantastic record. He's another voice like Louis Armstrong. It just, you hear it, you go like, that is no masquerade. I mean, that is the real deal. And then Peter, Paul, and Mary. Mary Travis used to live in Reading. So I don't know exactly. There was a time, believe it or not, when the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary, that was like more popular than the Beatles and the Rolling Stones did. And sometimes they would be paired up at jazz concerts, jazz and folk music. So they got to know each other a little bit. And so the idea of them collaborating on this tune came up. That's my little background on that.
So cool. And to take this tune, which some of you may recognize it, some audience members may associate it with Paul Simon, American tune. He takes that same melody, da 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 dee da dee dum, da 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 dee da da da, and he does his own thing with it. I think this is cool because, like you pointed out, these figures some of them are associated with genres that are pretty distant in the public mind from public consciousness from jazz. And I love the idea of your dad and Louis Armstrong working together. One of my favorite quotes about Armstrong is Duke Ellington said, "He was born poor, died rich, and never hurt anybody along the way." Which is, that's a pretty distinctive feather in the cap. All right, I'm going to go back to the beginning of this. And of course, it starts as a folk tune with, plucked guitar and nice tight harmony singing. And then, of course, it becomes something else. So this is Because All Men Are Brothers. And you see the album cover here.
Because all men are brothers, wherever men may be, one union shall unite us, forever proud and free. No tyrant shall defeat us, no nation strike us down. All men who toil shall greet us, the whole wide world around.
It's hard to listen to that and not be viscerally affected by it. The message, of course, is one that echoes Beethoven's Ninth, right? Because all men are brothers. It's actually almost a direct translation of the German from the Schiller poem. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, all men become brothers. But to take that text and fit it to this melody, what we call in music contrafact, to take a pre-existing melody and put new text to it, it's a pretty bold move, given the history and the richness of this original melody. Once again, Dave's playing is mesmerizing, he's captivating. Can you talk about what you hear when you're listening to it?
Well, you and I reacted at the same moment where he just sort of anticipated a cadence and did this quick jump thing that really
Yeah.
took me by surprise. It's like I felt like, where's he going? Oh man, that was a perfect move.
Yeah.
The other thing I got to say is hearing these lyrics, which I don't actually know exactly where they came from. I'm thinking like, oh my God, this is so damn quaint in our current world. Idealism, brotherhood, Christianity, true vibes. It's like this really struck me as, of course, I remember when they recorded this. I remember hearing this song. I remember this melody. Not every improvisation, but what really hit me just then was like emotionally. Oh my God, we have gone so far from that was mainstream musical lyric brotherhood, Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie thinking to where we are today.
Yeah,
And
you're so correct.
smack me on the head.
It does. It seems like a bygone era because the zeitgeist, the milieu, the ethos, whatever you want to call it, it seems so different now. Not just obviously in terms of the musical, the execution of the notes and the style, but certainly in terms of the lyrics. That I agree, that jumps out. What I love in Dave's playing here is he puts in where you think you're going to get a one chord, right, or a tonic or whatever you want to call it. As to the non-musicians, the one chord is sort of home base. That's the chord you're expecting. He puts in these plagal cadences. He's basically what we call in church the amen cadence.
Yeah.
You can hear it. I think if I snapped it correctly, it was around 2 minutes. Let me see if I got it. All right, you want to hear tonic note, but instead you go 4-1. It's great. It's just that's somebody who's really absorbed so many different styles, and it's such a church thing to do, right? That we call it the amen cadence. That if you look in a music theory textbook and you read about plagal cadences, it literally calls it the amen cadence.
Yeah.
So Dave's familiarity with, I think that's got to be a deliberate thing to tie it back to Bach and faith. Even though the lyrics here are not, it's a paean of praise to universal brotherhood. This is not a liturgical text. And yet the music at this moment, he does it twice. Those evasive moves where he, instead of hitting that one chord, bang, we get this church-like sound.
I got
cool.
a sidebar thing to add to this. As you're listening to the descending bass line, and you hear boom, boom, doom, 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 and this tempo. And it just struck me too that most people don't know this. In fact, I didn't know it until fairly recently. Someone told me. But Paul Simon, you mentioned, he said, "Slow down, you're moving too fast. You got to make the morning last." It's literally Gene Wright playing bass on that recording, and it's the same descending bass line. I'm not saying there's any plagiarism. I'm just saying it just reminded me of a funny story. And then maybe that's where he got the idea of like, I want to use Gene on that. It kind of reminds me of the vibe of this.
Hey, if it was plagiarism, Chris, we'd all be in a lot of trouble.
No.
If that constituted plagiarism, I think we.
No, I didn't mean that at all. This is like.
No, I know what you mean. We find it so much, with like Gershwin comes to mind in the "I Got Rhythm" chord changes. How many songs use those chord changes?
Sure.
You can't. The Supreme Court said you can't patent a chord change. You can't own it. So I guess you can't own a bass line either. All right.
No.
Dave, as we've now talked about Dave in a number of pieces, instrumental and vocal. We've established this incredible link between Brubeck and Bach. I want to talk about another Brubeck, namely you, Maestro. I want to talk about your experiences as we get to the back end of the program. And I got two pieces of yours that I want to share. And here I'm going to let you do most of the talking because these are pieces that were recorded. You mentioned Bill Crowfoot here on the banjo, and we're going to hear some of that in this piece called Preludium for Lute. I love this title because even the title seems to transport us back to a bygone era, take us back to the court of Henry VIII, or in the case of Bach, the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, Germany of the early 18th century. This is, as folks are seeing now from the album cover, here's a collaboration you did a couple of decades ago, right?
Yeah.
with the London Symphony Orchestra. Chris, that's about as big leagues get. Can you talk about this album and then maybe a little bit about this track before we listen?
Yeah, well, mainly Bill Crowfoot was always someone that was a catalyst kind of guy. He made things happen. And he did a record and asked me to write a string arrangement for a string quartet when I was about 13 years old. And I said, that's kind of crazy. I was basically the babysitter for his kids up on Spectacle Lane where he lived. And he said, I believe in you, can do this. And he was very encouraging with me about all kinds of music. And I went on tour with him for 1 year before I went to college. And so Bill Crowfoot, Joel Brown, a wonderful guitarist, and myself, Bill said, hey, we're selling enough CDs at our gigs. Let's go to London. Let's make a record with an orchestra. And I said, that's a crazy idea, Bill. He said, that's not crazy. We can do it. We've sold enough CDs. We could do it. So we really went in and we just went straight to Abbey Road Studios and recorded. It wasn't like we played 2 gigs and then recorded. So it was this huge leap off a cliff. And of course it was terrifying and wonderful all at the same time. And I really had to lay down a lot of cards on the table. And I must say, I probably, without Bill kicking me in the butt, I would have been too scared to do it. It's pretty crazy. But we got to the studio and just everything turned out so well. And I remember one of the things that was really a shock to me, the first playback was actually the first track on this record. I thought it felt really well. Bill would play his banjo with mutes on so that it sounded a lot like a harpsichord continuo. And we went back into the control room and heard it, and it sounded so great. We had played with other orchestras in the United States. And I said, and Joel Refson was doing such a great job conducting too. And God bless him, he just passed away from COVID, which is a real loss to me, as he was such an inspiration. And we were in the control room and we said, oh my God, how did the orchestra do that? They all suddenly got softer and the vibe changed and they had a crescendo. They did all these things. And the producer, Simon Rhodes, said, it's all in the score, Christopher. And even though I wrote it, I was so used to people not really playing what you wrote in the score that I was shocked. Like, why did that orchestra just sound so cool? Why did they do this and sound emotionally like they were connected? So it was quite a...
That's so awesome. And that takes us back to what we talked about in the very beginning of our evening, of how, jazz musicians and so-called classical musicians just have different impulses. And maybe it's that meticulous attention to dynamics and phrasing that gives a classical musician an advantage. Maybe they're just a little bit more sensitive to the tiny intricacies and the little nuances, which you might put in there and assume that whoever's reading it may or may not heed your instructions.
Right.
I love that. So you're actually kind of surprised when it's so crisp. And that's what happens when you're working, I guess, with world-class musicians. And not to say that you don't regularly work with world-class musicians, but to have a record like this, that's got to be a pretty special experience and a big feather in your cap. You must have been pretty satisfied when you came out of the studio with this one.
Oh yeah, we really were. I remember it took a while to digest it. My wife Tish and I remember the first time we really listened to it, we went up by Kent Falls. It was before Lime ticks were really terrible, and we laid out in the grass with headphones on and looked up at a beautiful sky. And we listened to it and said, wow, we pulled this off. We really did this. I had worked hard on writing these arrangements, and I wanted to be true to Bach, but yet have some poetic license to do it. And which track did you say you wanted to listen to?
We were going to do the Preludium for Lute, unless you want to do another one.
Maybe the third one might be. Is that easy for you to do?
Yeah, I'll bring it up. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to bring it up and then I'll go ahead and share.
All right. Because that has areas of improvisation in it that are really fun. And then for me, of course, at the end, the big bonus was after our last day of recording, we were out waiting outside, and there was a lot of hubbub going on in the studio, and they were tearing down the entire setup of the full orchestra and setting up like for a quartet. And I said, what's going on? And he said, well, just between you and me, his lordship is coming. And I thought, Prince Charles is coming into the studio. Was he doing some spoken word thing? So to make a long story shorter, Joel Brown waited up front so he could see him. And it was actually Paul McCartney coming in to do something. And I was in the Abbey Road. It has so many sections that they have beer gardens, their own beer garden. And so I was out there having a beer, and Joel came in with, like, he'd just seen a ghost, and he said, Paul McCartney asked me what I was doing there. And I said, I was recording with Chris Brubeck. And he said, Dave's son, the one that plays bass, tell him to pop in. I want to say hi to him. So it was like, oh my God, I got invited to see him. So it was like really cool, because I just worshiped the Beatles when I grew up. And so not only did I get to hear my Bach arrangements recorded, but on the same day, meet one of my idols out of the blue, you know.
Paul McCartney, wow. Another type of lordship altogether. I'm going to try to find it, but in the meantime, Chris, if it's okay with you, I'm going to keep things flowing here while I look for it, and we're probably going to end with that track. And let me go ahead and I'm going to switch gears and talk about another piece of yours, which you talked about, sort of tipping your hat to Bach and tipping your hat to these composers of yesteryear, but maintaining an authentic voice, an original voice. And I think one track where you absolutely achieve that with aplomb, I might say, is in this interplay for 3 violins and orchestra. So if we could listen to that, and then we'll come back to the LSO album.
Okay.
Okay, so here we have these 3 fabulous violinists. You can see their names up here. When you created this this work, did you have certain people in mind to play the violin parts?
Yes, the Boston Symphony Organization, Boston Pops, and Keith Lockhart came to me and said, we're doing a TV show about the violin, and we've got Nadja Salerno Sonnenberg representing the classical realm, Eileen Ivers representing Irish music, Celtic music, Regina Carter from the jazz world. And we need a concerto to wrap up the show. They've each had their moment as individuals. And we were trying to think of someone that bizarrely had experience in all 3 genres that can pull off the premiere of a new piece written for this TV show. So we knew exactly who it was. And I had a meeting with them all to see, you're talking about people that didn't want to improvise, like Nadja. For God's sakes, please don't. It would be like throwing her out of an airplane without a parachute. She didn't want to improvise. And each of them had their different things that they did and didn't want to do. But oddly enough, the more that I listened, I made a list of what they did or didn't want to do. It was one of the easiest pieces to write I've ever been involved with all the limitations. Limitations sometimes create freedom.
Absolutely. This is a piece that I only became familiar with recently. And I have to say, I listened to it a few times just today, and I find it captivating. What I think is so cool about it is how you're able to blend and meld and transition from one stylistic idiom to another, and to make it sound completely seamless. That's quite a feat, musically speaking. There are ways to do it, and I've kind of been studying it today to figure out exactly how you get from one section to another. But where we're going to pick up roughly in the middle here, we get this section that almost seems like, you know, Danny Boy up on the glen, playing to serenade the villagers. It almost makes you wistful and nostalgic. And then we get into this, again, more intricate section, clearly influenced by the Baroque or even the classical style, where we have circle of fifths harmony and rapid passages and call and response texture. And then we get this big surprise at the end. We're going to listen to all 3 of those sections in the back half of this work. Again, for the folks at home, this is Interplay for 3 Violins and Orchestra by Chris Brubeck. And Chris, you wrote this about 20 years ago?
I guess so.
All right, the audio quality is great here, but the video is standard definition. So it may seem a little bit hiccupy. Nonetheless, the audio is crystal clear. So here we have, again, Interplay for 3 Violins by Chris Brubeck. Chris, I think I speak for everybody listening right now that, man, that is just good stuff. And those ladies have chops. Wow.
Yeah. Why did they ever?
That one lick that Eileen plays at the end is just, wow. It's impressive. What's so cool to me, and I mentioned this earlier, but it bears repeating because it's sort of the theme of our evening here, is how stylistically versatile you are as a composer and how these I mean, you've got an ending which sounds like it could come out of a Mendelssohn concerto. Then you've got some Antonio Carlos Jobim before that. And you've got some Mozart and Bach before that. You got some Alberti bass in the piano at one point. And then before that, where did you learn how to write Celtic music? I mean, where does all this come from?
Just hanging out with the wrong people, I guess. I kept my ears open. I listened to their most recent records and see, well, they're capable of doing this, they're capable of doing that. And I'm not a violinist. I'm very fortunate. I think Nadja, with all this sort of more classical stuff, she maybe changed 3 or 4 notes or said, if I could change this one note, I could switch positions better. I've just been very fortunate that my musical intuitions, I have a brand new concerto that just came out with Sharon Isbin playing called Affinity, a guitar concerto with orchestra. And again, she kept saying, you play guitar. Well, I used to play sort of Peter, Paul and Mary guitar a little bit, and nothing like she does. She's fabulous, but I just went for it, and the musical gods were smiling on me, and she didn't have to adjust too much, so it was just such a thrill that, hearing that tape just takes me back. What a thrilling night for a composer to see that go down.
I can't even imagine to see the Boston Pops with Lockhart conducting in Symphony Hall. I mean, that's you're breathing rarefied air there, Maestro.
Yeah, I've been very lucky.
Just a kid from Wilton, right?
Yeah.
And there he is. I'm going to let our listeners check out your album with the London Symphony Orchestra, because I see we are past 6:30, and I know we have some questions, Michael. I see they've been trickling in throughout the duration of the program. So I want to ask Chris one last question before we take those questions. Chris, I'm kind of glad we ended with Interplay because, as I said, it showcases the versatility and your almost subconscious indebtedness to so many different styles. With respect to Bach and yourself and Dave and so many great musicians that you've collaborated with over the years, what do you think it is about Bach's music that continues to speak to musicians? And before you answer, let me just point out to the audience that, folks, if you open a music theory textbook, and especially a music history textbook, what you'll find is that Bach is the earliest composer that people really know that he's present in the public consciousness. There are plenty of great composers before Bach, but most people have never heard of Dietrich Buxtehude. Most people have never heard of Heinrich Schütz or Jan Peterson Sweelinck. And these were great composers, but it's Bach who's sort of the Ursprung. He's the original, as some of my students say, the OG. Chris, what do you think it is about Bach that makes this music so special?
I think this is probably heresy to some, but I sort of think that God puts musical angels on the earth at different times. And Lord knows that we need as many angels as possible, but I think Bach was one of them. I think that he has a quality to his music that is beyond academic analysis, even though you can analyze it. But like you said, why is he so special? He was just this great musical angel that just, has a mystical attraction from a lot of people, and they listen to his music. And like when I was working on arranging the stuff, like on this third track, of course, in a way, I had to improvise what I'm arranging. Stravinsky said that composition is selective improvisation.
I like that.
That was a great quote my dad taught me. So I remember writing out this D minor prelude, and then like 2 a.m, sort of getting this inspiration from above, like this is the cello line I'm hearing against it,
Wow.
over those changes. But I remember it was kind of a spiritual experience for me when I came out of those 2 hours of writing in the wee hours of the morning. Like I felt connected to this spirit. And, someone might say, boy, is this kid delusional or something? But, somehow it ended up with the London Symphony, and somehow there's this recording. And the way this piece is laid out, there's these little areas of improvisation. And there's a final improvisation on the piano. And the producer said, well, Chris, you're going to go out there and play that with the London Symphony. And I said, no, whoa. I thought you were going to, after everyone left, I was supposed to do it and we'd cut it in or something, edited it in. And he said, no, you've got to go do it. So anyhow, that was a great terror mountain. You know, that's like when you go up very high on the roller coaster, you go, you feel like a mile high and all of a sudden, shoo! But, you know, I lived through it and I'm grateful, you know.
Well, I can relate to the feeling because I had a similar experience when Michael Bellicosa told me, oh, can you do a program on Bach and Brubeck? I said, oh, absolutely. He said, oh, well, can you do a program with Chris Brubeck? Oh, wait, you mean the Chris Brubeck? You want me to get on a call with him in front of a bunch of people? But this has been such a delight, such a pleasure getting your insights. You're such a real musician's musician. And I'm not just blowing smoke there. I think your versatility and your understanding, your ears, and your understanding of style and history. There are great players and great musicians historically who don't have all those tools in their belt, but you do, and you are a treasure to the Wilton community, to Connecticut, and to music in general. So thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you for those very kind words, and it was a great pleasure to get to know you. I've always heard great things about your lectures and everything like that, but believe me, I wish I had a lot of the academic chops and knowledge that you're carrying around. Hey, maybe between the two of us, we got it all covered, or a lot of it covered.
I'll trade you anytime. At this point, I'm going to welcome back Michael Bellicosa. Michael, do we have some questions that you want to convey to us from the audience?
Yeah, just a couple really at this point. We'll see if we get a few more. Anyway, first I want to thank you guys. That was absolutely fantastic. You know,
Just
we
two
had
musicians talking shop.
Well, you know, that was part of the absolute greatness of it, and that spontaneity. You know, I'll just tell people a little inside baseball. We had a little sort of a run-through meeting this morning to make sure who's doing what when, but we didn't do a fully planned run-through on purpose, really, so that it could have the kind of spontaneity that we had tonight, which was really great and really wonderful music. What I've got two questions. One might be a little hard to answer on the spot, but I'll give it to you anyway. And the other one might be a really good question for you and Chris to both sort of riff on as a great kind of summation of what this was all about. So a very specific question, I don't know, Gil, if you've got the answer, is someone asked, what was the last chord of Because All Men Are Brothers? I mean, without the music in front of you, you might not just know what it was, but that's one of them.
I don't have perfect pitch, but I can tell you what Roman numeral they ended on. It was you know, the thing about that tune is that the way it is, so the melody ends on mi and here's do. So it's sort of an unusual piece in that way because the melodic final note is not the same as the bass final note. But I think it just ends on the tonic.
Perfect.
And that is.
So here's a question that may be a really good one to conclude the evening with both of your thoughts on it, and especially thinking about right from the beginning of this presentation, where you know Bach was undoubtedly a great improviser, and ultimately, probably I'm just saying this. I'm not a musicologist, but I love Bach, but probably more than any other classical composer and musician, but that he wrote things down sort of because he had to, because someone asked him to. He wasn't really writing them down to compose them because he was improvising. So you've got this great juxtaposition that you have really illustrated, the two of you really illustrated tonight really well, between the act of composition, which turns into musicians reading the notes that are written down, and the act of improvisation, which is a great dichotomy in the world of music. So here's the big question at the end. Can a jazz piece that features improvisation ever be played again the same way, or would that defeat the purpose of jazz?
Great question. Oh, I would say in a way it does defeat the purpose of jazz. And my father used to say, I think of myself as a composer that performs jazz. And again, it goes back to that Stravinsky quote, you know, where does the idea come from? You know, what part of your brain, or does it get plucked out of the sky when you're improvising? And if you're a composer, that happens too. And then you have to have a filter that, like if I were totally paranoid, like, oh, that idea is not good enough, you would never get anything written. So you have to have a little faith that some kernel of a musical cell of an idea is worth pursuing. And I don't know, it's an incredible thing to improvise and to compose. Gil, I'm going to turn over to you.
Yeah, when I was a student, when I was first learning jazz, I remember I would get these books of transcriptions. Coltrane transcriptions primarily was what really enchanted me back then. And I would learn these solos, and they were incredibly difficult, intricate solos. And one thing about them is very interesting as a student. And Chris, you can testify to this. It's a chicken and an egg question, right? Which came first, the sheet music or the solo? Obviously, the answer is the solo. And you can tell that by looking at the music, because it looks so ridiculous when they try to write out these rhythms. And they, here's 17 eighth notes in the span of 4 quarter notes. It shows you that you really can't recreate exactly what Coltrane did. And the evidence is that the closest thing that the editor came up with is 17 against 4 polyrhythm. That's not what Coltrane set out to do. He had whatever idea he had in mind, one starting note, one ending note. So I always think of those transcriptions as kind of proof that any attempt to crystallize jazz and recreate it, an improvised solo, will, no matter how well executed, will always sound a little bit contrived.
Right.
And so maybe that's the answer to the question, is that you can recreate solos, and in doing so, it's a tremendous testament to the performer. I mean, a lot of these solos are very hard to recreate, but it's missing something, that magic ingredient, which of course is the improvisation.
And another factor is, like, I think there's a tremendous classical pianist named Yves Theobald. Does that sound right?
Theobald, yeah.
Okay. So curiously, he did a salute to Bill Evans, where someone transcribed a complete Bill Evans album, and then he played it. And although part of me saying, isn't it great that a great classical player thinks enough of Bill Evans that he would do a recording of it? Another part of me said, well, what's the point of that?
Yeah.
It's another thing for the writer of the question to ponder.
It's reinventing the wheel to some degree.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
Well, yeah, and I think those are some great, insightful responses to that question. It's a question that anyone who loves jazz music should think about that quite a bit. And I think the people here tonight, they got a lot more food for thought. A lot of things I'm sure that most people in this audience had no idea about before starting 90 some minutes ago. So you really did a great job with this program, Gil and Chris. Absolutely wonderful. So I see no other questions. I see a couple. Thanks so much. This was great. Those are good things to see at the end of the chat window.
Awesome.
So let's we'll call it quits. We'll go on to our Friday evening and the weekend. Everybody enjoy the weekend and the evening. And thanks again, Gil and Chris.
My pleasure.
Maybe we'll try to do something else like this again.
All right.
Thank you, Michael.
And
Thank
let me join you again. Thank you so much, both of you, for letting us be part of this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thanks to Wilton Library. Thank you, Michael and Elaine. And thanks for the audience for listening to this.
Absolutely. Thank you, folks.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks everybody.
Have a good night.
Good night.